It's a real privilege to be here today. Actually, I'll start with a plug, which is very cheeky, but we just recently launched a report which focuses on the UK's future work called the Blueprint for Good Work, where we identify 4 challenges which I think, as the debate goes, we can explore whether they are universal and they are sort of democratic data, strong worker voice, safety net, a modern safety net, and lifelong learning. Now, of course, all of these areas, whether it's the data that is being used by some governments to keep track of the pandemic or to monitor social distancing, whether it's the role of unions and worker voice organizations in restructuring workplaces so we can fight the pandemic, whether it's the safety net, which is going to be tested by unemployment in a way which, at least in the UK, we haven't seen for generations, or whether it's lifelong learning and the need to now train workers who have been left high and dry by the pandemic for sectors where there are still jobs. We're all going to be, our systems and our approach to the future work are all going to be tested like never before. And I think this event is particularly fantastic because, you know, the pandemic is, of course, a global event. It doesn't discriminate amongst any of us, and it is going to strike all of us at some point. But our ability to deal with the economic side of things and the labour market challenges are going to be massively varied depending on our systems and our abilities, our finances, and all the other political factors that go into the response. So I think it's really, really great that we've got a fantastic panel here today that spans a breadth of perspectives across the Global South. We've got Karin Fernando, who is a senior research professional at the Centre for Poverty Analysis, which is based in Sri Lanka. We've got Paul Lakuma, who joins us from Uganda. He's a research fellow at the Economic Policy Research Centre in Kampala. And we've got Ramiro Albrieu, who is a principal researcher of the Economic Development Programme at the Centre for the Implementation of Public Policies Promoting Equity and Growth in Buenos Aires, Argentina. We'll start really by getting a little bit of sense check on how the pandemic is playing out in the labour markets and the economies of our panelists. And so I think I'll come to Karin first, then Paul, then Ramiro, and just ask each of you, how is the pandemic playing out in your context, and what sort of vulnerabilities has it exposed and exacerbated? That's certainly our experience in the UK, that many of the pre-existing disadvantages and inequalities have been accentuated. So if I could get your reflections on that, that would be fantastic, starting with Karin.
So actually, in this region, I think also for the rest of South Asia region that I know of, the lockdowns were pretty strict. Sri Lanka actually imposed curfew, which actually meant that we could not really move around freely at all, and this actually really restricted the way work was organized. Work from home was what we were told, but this is really not something that is familiar to people, so this was not something people really knew how to do. Drawing very much from a survey that we CEPA conducted for 400 that got responses from 466 respondents, what we found was that the drops in incomes were actually felt by all types of job categories actually, no matter if you were a manager, professional, teaching, technical, whatever, because literally your access to the job market was pretty much restricted. But actually for the category of entrepreneurs or own account workers, the hit was much, much harder. This is also actually because the ability to work, the types of jobs that people are involved in really require you not to be at home. And because homes are not set up for those kinds of jobs. We also, the reason it hit right across the board is because Sri Lanka is also 60% an informal workforce. So most people are pretty much dependent on daily wages, irregular wages. So these kinds of, the pandemic really had an impact on that. And there was kind of like a and a stipulation that if you needed to cut down, at least 40% of wages needed to be paid. So technically wages, there was a cut in wages. The other kind of interesting thing was that the agriculture sector, although was told to be active because the entire value chain did not function, there were people farming. It was actually the harvesting season, but they could not get their goods to market. So in the end, there was so much wastage. And in the end, farmers were also not really able to make their income. I also want to focus a little bit in particular about another very key group of workers that's not only important for Sri Lanka, but also for the region, that is the migrant workers. For Sri Lanka, actually, they're the highest income earner. In 2019, they brought in 6.7 billion. Up to May 2020, the World Bank says the drop in income earning was 12%. They predict that it will decline by 19%. This is also very much to do with contraction in other economies, of course. And this is also the duality of this, right? Because like you said, this is a global issue. So Sri Lanka's workforce issues are pretty much dependent on what is going to happen globally. And the kinds of jobs that are affected range from people working in the as domestic workers, construction, hospitality, retail, wholesale, tourism, all those sectors. So a whole range of migrant workers are actually pretty much affected. It's not only about job losses, but it's about the fact that the wages were cut, they were not paid, and also that some of them, when their contracts were finished, were also rendered illegal, but actually were not able to leave the countries. And also the fact that the way certain things, especially most of Sri Lanka's migrants actually end up in the Middle East, and there is this idea that they're not really assimilated into the country, so they don't get access to things like healthcare, or it's very much dependent on employers and contracts. So like you were talking earlier about safety nets, these are some of the issues because it doesn't become very much a responsibility of the country they're in. They're also at risk to infection. So when it came to the issue of trying to bring them back into the country, they were going to become a burden to the health sector of Sri Lanka again. So it became this kind of unfortunate situation where in the end the airport was closed and Sri Lanka brought in a couple of rounds of migrants, and they tested pretty high for COVID. And then they did not really push very hard to bring the rest of the migrants back. The long-term effect of this is that with the countries contracting and not really wanting more migrants at the moment, the unemployment issues are going to rise in the country for the long term. So with the economic situation for Sri Lanka, with governments also contracting, tourism also contracting, having the migrants also back in the country, shows the quite serious vulnerabilities for the economy for us right now.
Thank you, Karin. Paul, what are your reflections on the Ugandan experience and how workers have been affected there?
First of all, let's first get to learn the structure of the employment or the labor sector in Uganda. Okay, there are 9 million people in the job market in Uganda. A lot of Ugandans are young. Up to 60% are below 15, so they can't work. So about 9 million people in the labor force. Out of that, only 1.5 are in the formal sector. So 1.5 million are in the formal sector, and that means 7.5 million are in the informal sector or somehow self-employed. Self-employment may mean a hand-to-mouth daily wage. That said, we did a survey, and it exposed that in the next 6 months, 4 million people, that includes those in the formal sector and those who are self-employed or those in participating in enterprises or entrepreneurs, are going to lose their businesses temporarily. About 600,000 are going to lose their businesses or lose their jobs permanently due to COVID and the effects of the containment measures, such as lockdown and instituting of standard operating procedures, which have increased the cost of doing business, such as a strict requirement or to have things such as a sanitizer, hand washing materials, and full PPE for some sectors, such as the hospitality sector. As my colleague from Sri Lanka put it, all sectors have been hit, although some sectors have experienced more hit than others. Here, the tourism sector has been hit largely because of the closure of the border, closure of the airport. The tourism sector is a major sector in Uganda. It gets about 1/10 or 10% of Uganda's GDP is contributed by the tourism sector. It contributes about $2 billion per year and employs a significant amount of people. So that has taken up to 80% hit. That means a lot of people have lost their jobs through salary cuts, and some have been laid off permanently. The issue of lack of credit has been exposed. It used to exist, but it has come up and it's now in people's faces. One, it's by scale. The smaller farms are unable to access the fiscal packages which have been put by the government. The government has come up and put up some fiscal packages, but these fiscal packages are delivered through the commercial bank system. The commercial bank system still has some due diligence requirements, which include knowing your customer and things such as collateral. So these has disadvantaged the micro and the small farms and women who do not inherit property originally. Uganda is and the rest and most of Africa is very paternal. Property is transferred from fathers to sons and not from fathers to daughters. So a lot of women have not been able to access credit. Also, gender rules have changed, and a lot of the men who are employed in the formal sector or employed in the industrial sector are now at home. Women who mostly tend to be self-employed are now the ones taking care of the family. So the gender roles have switched. Men are doing the care business at home, and women are the ones who are the breadwinners now. But this comes with a cost to women, because it means when the lockdown is over, or when we are in the post-COVID period, if at all that ever comes, women will have depleted their finances because of the extra load they have taken out of being the breadwinners of the family, and men will just get back to their old jobs. So this will exacerbate gender inequalities. We have seen the lack of social protection for workers. As I said, only 1.5 million people are in the formal sector, so and they have some form of protection in terms of health insurance, a provident fund accessible at 55 years old at retirement. But the rest of the population, the rest of the 7.5 million, don't have any form of social protection, and this brings to fore the idea that we need to come up with a form of social protection for workers. Fiscal challenges notwithstanding. The issue of child labor has come up with parents at home with no transportation. We locked up all kinds of transport here. Apart from only essential workers could access transportation. There was no private transport, there was no public transport. So you had to stay at home. And only children or children of 14, 15, 16 are able to walk for long distances to access the markets. And we have seen a lot of school children engaging in business, and this exposes them to a lot of vulnerabilities, including abuse, and this brings to fore the issue of child labor, which was not very common in Uganda. We have seen also the weaknesses of the health sector. Though Uganda is used to handling pandemics before, we have managed Ebola, and that's why our performance in terms of the number of infections and the zero fatality, no one has died of COVID yet in Uganda up to now for almost 4 months now. But in the regional hospitals, what has come out is doctors don't have simple things like gloves, masks, and PPEs, and this has really exposed the government of the need to invest more monies into the health sector, and especially for frontline workers, to protect the frontline workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Ramiro, would you share us the experience from Argentina?
So, well, first, hi from a cold and lockdown Buenos Aires. I think that the impact is huge. I mean, huge. I mean, we have never seen something like that in the past, in terms of GDP, in terms of wages. So I believe that we are going through a period of crisis that, remember that COVID was a huge shock when we were going through a crisis. So it's not just a crisis without that mixed with the debt crisis. So it's really complex, the outlook in Argentina. We have this severe lockdown with the idea of manage physical proximity, right? To reduce physical proximity de jure or by law. And this frees the labor market. About half of the labor market used to work just hand in hand in close contact with each other. So they are not allowed to go to work. Also, they are not, or half of the labor market, but a different half, are not allowed to use public transport. So it's a huge drop in income for households and also for firms in Argentina in the middle of this macroeconomic crisis. So it's really complex. So I believe that this COVID just exposed our main character as a society that is inequality, right? We are, as in Latin America in general, we are not rich and we are not poor, we are both. Someone are rich, someone are poor. So remember that Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. Africa is trying to catch up now, but we still have this price. So I believe that in a way, the COVID exposed this, how rich people are managing the crisis and how poor people are managing the crisis. It's so different. And why? Because in a way, the government decide this lockdown. They say health first, okay, but lockdown works for the middle class and for the upper middle class, and it's hard to comply with this law for the poor people. So why? Because first, because they have low protection at home. In a way, the idea of lockdown is that you are going to mitigate the risk, but in a way you are migrating this risk to your house. So it depends on the conditions of your house, if you can manage the health risks or not. So that was a huge difference, because at the beginning of the crisis, the health risk was in the upper class who were traveling around the world, but now it is in the shanty towns. So you can see this migration of risks from the rich people to the poor people who have no protection at home. And second, the income losses are really hard to bear for the poor. Why? Because they work in these high proximity shops. So now they need to see what to do and in this context. So I believe that everyone was affected, but informal workers and women are particularly these two groups that are particularly affected by the crisis. Informal workers, because at the end of the day, they decide just to manage de facto their own risks, their own health risks. They decide to violate the law and just go and work. And this is about 40% of the population. Sorry, 40% of the labor market. So it's really, it's hard to think how can you help them, under this situation. And the government just copy this idea of the lockdown from Europe, but without taking into account that our society is different, So in a way, we are, the upper middle class, are teleworking now. But if you look at data, the upper decile, the richest, about 6 out of 10 can telework, and the lowest decile is just 5% can telework. So in a way, the way you are dealing with the crisis is creating a new set of risks that are basically in the poor people, and particularly in informal workers, because the government tried to implement a lot of a huge fiscal package, but just for the formal sector. So it's really hard to see, how informals are doing now, because we don't even have information about them. So it's really complex. And second, women, because women work in high proximity jobs, in health, domestic workers, in hotels and restaurants. So they are hit really hard for this, and the government has no plan yet for them. Just to say, well, maybe I can mitigate some of the impact on your income, but what about the near future? What about the next month? The government has no fiscal space to deal with that, to finance this over a 3 or 6 month horizon. They just have money for 1 month, and that's it. So we don't know about what will happen, but maybe I believe that the virus will be around us for a long time, and particularly in shanty towns and poor neighborhoods, and so it's really a little pessimistic, my view about the near future.
I'm really struck by some of the, obviously incredibly different in different contexts, but some of the universal challenges that people have had to face. Certainly in the UK, the RSA did a little bit of data work on the relationship between the ability to home work and earnings and income, and it's a huge class issue. The relationship is almost perfect between the ability to home work and whether you are a high earner, as it goes down the scatter plot. But the one thing that I think leapt out to me the most across all three of your experiences is just how, however partial the response and however tough the economic conditions, it does appear, and this is absolutely true in the UK, where I think we've probably had the most generous or close to the most generous package of support in the world for employees. The self-employed and the informal parts of the economy have been disadvantaged relative to employees. So I'd like to ask all of the panel, and I think we'll go in reverse order. So we'll start with you, Ramiro. Do you have any kind of policy options? It's obviously very difficult circumstances in Argentina in particular at the moment, but are there any policy options that could have managed the experience for the informal or the self-employed better?
Maybe one idea was to work harder with the formal sector in terms of mobility and just let the informal sector to move. first. I mean, go a little harder with the formal sector in terms of lockdowns, in terms of use of public transports and all that, and just let the informal sector to move, right? Second, I mean, the government here implemented a basic income, I can say, just for the emergency, for the poor people, but again, it was really to implement because of they need a bank account, they need to be part of the financial system, and they are not. So I believe that maybe they could have worked harder on creating the conditions for the implementation of this particular income policy. I don't know. Finally, I don't know. I believe that in a way, in the future you will have to focus these scarce resources of the fiscal government just to this particular part of the labor market. They are not doing that. Of course, everyone is asking for help, and that's what you expect in a way. But I believe that you need to think that for these informal workers that are basically working on high proximity shops, for them, I believe that you need to say, okay, you need to stay at home. I will give you more money than now, but just stay at home for this period. And at the same time, working on improving their home conditions, because again, I mean, of course, these are all long-run policies. They're hard to implement, but the challenge is huge. I mean, we are living this situation, not a different situation. So I believe that also the government needs to work a little harder on improving, water. I mean, getting water to these shanty towns, improving all the home conditions for them. Maybe a more focalized policy just, in the city of Buenos Aires and in the shanty towns in the city. Maybe I believe that this is the right way to go. But again, I believe that it's really complex, then the specifics of this policy.
Thank you. And Paul, the same question. I mean, you already sketched out some of the operational challenges and the need to be in the financial system to receive income support. But is there any scope for, whether during the pandemic or beyond, is there any scope for better protections for the informal sector and self-employed workers in Uganda and in the African region, the West African region? And what policies do you see as being important there?
I'll focus on the policy implemented by Uganda. The one which seemed to work very well, not perfectly, but it did leave some gap. One was a food distribution. The government came up with a measure to distribute food to starting with the urban poor, and this was done with the conjunction with the office of the Prime Minister and the military, and we have some data on the characteristics of who is urban poor, but still we don't have proper addresses in Uganda. We don't have proper street addresses. We don't have proper home addresses. We don't know the households by name. We don't have any data set. We have data sets in different institutions, but these data sets have not been brought together. And that's one challenge which came at the forefront. And I think there are steps. The Ministry of Finance here is going to confront that challenge and bring all the data sets together, the national ID system, the data sets from utility companies, from the banks, from the birth registration, and bring them together so that we can create one unified system of information, which would help us in the future in case we have something which has to be democratically distributed. The beauty of the food packages, as you know, the people in the lowest quintile of the income structure spend up to 80% of their income on food. So if the government buys food for them, that means they release this income, or they create a saving for these families. And remember, the enterprises in Uganda, there are 7.5 million enterprises, mostly family owned, and even the employees are family members. So if the government provides food, then the families have some extra money to put into their business and keep it alive, and employ family members, and employ the neighbors, and create jobs, looking forward to the post-COVID period. I think trust, accountability are key issues here. Data challenges notwithstanding, we still need to create a good data system which identifies our families, our households, individuals, in a unified manner, in a centralized manner, but we still need to build trust, and our governments need to be more accountable in delivery of these policies.
Thank you, Paul. And Karin, could you, I mean, it sounds like there's all sorts of challenges in Sri Lanka, as you sketched out, and that the dynamic of migrant workers and remittances is something that was really, really profound in your contribution earlier. Are there any hopes for picking up on this challenge that in all, we faced it in the UK too? One of the reasons why the self-employed response has been not as strong or as easy as the employee response is a lack of data and operational issues in reaching those workers. But I mean, how has that played out in Sri Lanka, and what hopes are there for the future?
So one of the ways in which reaching out to migrants can be improved is actually if the migrants are properly registered and there is good documentation on them, and that the registration processes actually have to be updated so that they can also be traced. So if there are any safety nets or any sorts of ways in which they can be reached, they can be done through this registration process. There is already a system already in place by the Bureau of Employment, but it has to be done on a regular basis, and there has to be good follow-up and a good rapport built with the migrants that are going, which isn't always the case. And if the information is actually in good condition, it also means that they can be tracked better. There could be a better information exchange, because it has to happen through the embassies in all these different countries. So that's one issue that needs to be done well. The other issue is that there has to be, I mean, and this is not new, this is not like really something coming out just because of COVID, but there has been a push to improve relationships between the countries, to improve the kinds of policies, the safety nets that are anyway there for migrants. So this is another opportunity to really, I guess, fight for that to happen. It could be a multilateral mechanism, it could be a bilateral mechanism, really depending on what works better. And there are some emerging markets outside the Gulf countries that have probably better environments, that could also be places that migrants can be sent to, and these are things that can be explored, but really there has to be much better mechanisms of protecting them. These are not things that are not known, but aren't always also very easy to push for, but definitely things that should be pushed for. One of the other things I just want to touch on is this idea of contracting. We talk a lot about how everything is opening up we do have high informality, and when you think about labor standards, the ideal is that you have to become a more formal business and you have to have formalized standards in trade unions and things like that. But then you think about where we are progressing and we are becoming more digital. We are talking about platform workers and things actually going beyond the boundaries of your countries. And it actually opens up workers to much more insecurities if you aren't properly contracted, if you don't have ways of collective bargaining. So we really do need to think of much more innovative mechanisms that can protect workers. There aren't a lot of good systems in place, but there are kind of interesting examples that have happened, like transitioning that have come, for example, from the energy sector that happened in Europe, where people had to move from coal energy to renewable energy, that also skilled people, etc. But we have to think of systems that give people better contracting. And this health issue is also one thing that we need to think about. I want to reflect on something that was said also in Argentina, which also is the same issue here. The workers that went out there to really work were the people who were at the bottom of the chain, isn't it? Because they are the ones who bought us our food, they are the ones who are cleaning the hospitals, all of that. And they have to have better protection mechanisms to also be able to do those work and to protect them from those risks. So the need to really think about better contracting, better ways in which even informal, what we are calling informal work, can be more protected without always thinking of what we know as that formal system is required.
Thank you, Ramiro, Karin, and Paul. I think that was very interesting and nice comparison of the experiences in 3 different regions of the world. I've picked up a few comments and questions. Let me outline them first, and maybe you can address them in time, Alan. You can decide how to. I don't know. Maybe you can go one at a time. But the first one is a question by Henna Ali. Has there been a rise in community-based organizations or community-based organizing as a response to the crisis? I mean, the picture you paint to different degrees, and that I can relate to here in Peru, is that the government has not been able to provide everything that is necessary, especially for the most vulnerable workers. So my question is whether those vulnerable workers and their communities have been able to self-organize to provide some of that support. The opposite side of this, there's another question by David Jackson, I think. Yes, David, who asks if there have been any increase in, let's say, theft criminality as a response to the crisis. And maybe what could be labeled desperate actions, such as begging, moving into the informal sector, and even more desperate actions like prostitution. So the absence of the state, have communities been able to pull together and help each other, or have people had to sort of fend for themselves in your countries? And then another question that I think that I am asking, I think, because it comes up from the conversation, is can you think of or share any successful policy responses in your countries that have addressed some of the problems that vulnerable workers are facing? So, has anything worked in Argentina, Sri Lanka, or Uganda, or in your regions? And you think these are good practices that others around the world should be paying attention to?
Fantastic. I think that community versus, I guess, sort of its social breakdown question is really, really interesting. So, and maybe the policy one is a fantastic one to take into the breakout groups too, though. So maybe we'll do that one very, very quickly first and see if we can get a bit of time before the breakout groups to explore the community question. So very, very quickly, I'll go to Karin first. Are there any policies that have worked in Sri Lanka or your region?
I mean, there were relief packages that were done, which I think which were pretty much helpful, and they did rely on the existing structures and systems to actually manage to reach out to people. And that was okay. One of the other packages that is targeted, which is okay and not different from what other people are trying to do, is to support SMEs in particular, because they are one of the largest groups and also one of the largest, also most vulnerable, and don't have any sort of buffer and needs a little bit of support. And there was also some debt relief that was given. I also think that the fact that for Sri Lanka, the fact that our health system was really able to manage the pandemic so well was really, I mean, otherwise I cannot imagine where we would be. They were well trained and they gave out the information. People trusted the system. So that was also very telling of a system that was well established and knew what they were doing. And also that one of the things I feel that also could have been really, can also really would have enriched the system was that the public health system, the community awareness system could have also kicked in a little bit better to reach out to the communities a bit more. But because of the whole lockdown idea, that part of it didn't kick in very well. It did a little bit later, but actually the way the health sector managed it was actually pretty good. So it was a really, I mean, it's being quoted as having managed the pandemic well. So yeah, it was having good policies in place.
Excellent. And so maybe I'll move it up a bit and go to Ramiro now. Particularly as I feel you sketched out the most, the bleakest of all scenarios, perhaps. Is there anything that has worked in the region, in South America or Argentina specifically?
Well, I believe in some cases they try to implement some community lockdown instead of home lockdown, just for the poor neighborhoods, because they say they need to move, they need to go and get their money each day. So this first strategy of thinking differently about different classes, I think that was a good idea, and it worked in many cases. So I believe that this idea of home lockdown against a community lockdown, it was a right way to go. And the second thing is that I think that in the Argentine case, I think that they are able to learn. And that's something, for in our case, that's something really strong, saying they are getting feedback and changing the policies in light of new data. Well, that's maybe is a common practice elsewhere, but it's not here. Here we are more used to, I have an idea, I'm going to just to pursue this without any regard of data or comments. I believe that now, in a way, the government is more open to learn and to decide on the basis of data. This is very general, but I think that this is important in the sense that there's a lot of uncertainty about the virus, about all that, and using data and exploiting data to feed policy. I think that that's also something that I have to say for the Argentine case.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting point. I mean, I think we've just reached this interesting intersection in the UK where the government has lots of really good data and is acting on it, but isn't sharing it with a lot of the partners that it needs to help it as we move to a kind of more community-based lockdown approach. Paul, finally, we'll just come to you and what, if anything, has worked in the Ugandan or African experience?
Well, yes, I'll start with the issue of whether, because that's part of the policy also, or the measures, whether theft, begging, prostitution has increased. No. Mostly because, particularly for Uganda, there was a curfew at 7. Even now, the curfew is there. Right now, I'm at home. In 2 hours, I won't be able to move. If I move out, I could end up in a lot of trouble with the military. So that kind of stopped. That we have not heard of any serious cases of theft. Or prostitution has also been capped by that, but that also presents a new vulnerability in that group. That it means they are exposed to dangers such as starvation for that group of people. Begging, maybe at daytime, I've seen a lot of kids who beg around, and that's a rising phenomena. I've seen a lot of teenagers begging for food, begging for money, especially during the rush hours. So that's something the government needs to look at. Other policies which have worked is flexibility in working time, especially people in the public sector. People are now working in shifts. This is a new thing. Some people work this week, other people work next week, like that. Keep on shifting to minimize the risk of infection and contagion, and also minimize the risk of losing every worker. If some people get sick, there will be other people to work. So departments have been asked to create people, to cluster people into groups so that they work in shifts. There's a 70-30 policy also in the public sector. And the public sector has about 400,000 workers. That includes the police, the military, people like me, people in the government, and teachers, and all that. So it's quite a large sector. It's about 50% of the formal sector, the public sector, who work for the government. So it's quite. That's why I'm also focusing there. There's been a policy on wages first in government expenditure. So no capital expenditure before you pay wages. So all people in the government sector have been receiving their salaries. There's not been any salary cut in the public sector, which helps the economy because the demand stays up, and this money also trickles down to the people in the lower sector of the country. But it also creates a venue for income inequality between people in the public sector and those in the private sector. Meaning, there has been a lot of salary cuts. Some people, and the last ones I've had is 50% salary cuts, especially people in the education sector. There are others, suspension of their contracts to a future date, meaning they will not be paid. They'll still have a job, but they will not be paid until this crisis go away. So there's a venue for income inequality. Very in the post-COVID period, we'll find richer people or people with money, especially people who worked in the public sector, and people without money, people who were in the private sector, which was the opposite, because people in the private sector tend to have more favorable packages, more favorable salary, higher salary, and everything. But now people in the public sector have their salaries secured by a government policy. Then the private sector, they are not secure. Yeah, some are losing jobs, some are losing salary, some are getting salary cuts. So that's a policy which is good, but may also accentuate income inequality. There's an MSME loan. The issue, it's a good policy, but the issue of data, as I spoke earlier, knowing who should get, which by scale, by sector, which sector, which size, who will get, how will it be delivered? That's a question. The government is also trying to create a local supply chain or a regional supply chain. Remember, a lot of our intermediates come from China, and now we can't access the China input market, and the government is thinking of something similar to an input substitution policy, although that's maybe not the politically correct term to use, because it's kind of a trigger word, but something, let's call it import replacement. Government is thinking of import replacement. Tax, there's been tax cuts, pay as you earn, that is a personal income tax. For 3 months, people will not be paying income tax. People for certain sectors, not everybody, certain sectors. Now the question here is which sectors? Why those sectors? For us, like for me, I continue to pay my personal income tax, but some people have received a reprieve for 3 months. So the criteria of who gets and who doesn't, and how that addresses the issue of equity. Thank you.
Cool. And I think there was a point in there that you know, people are going to be arguing about the you know, who benefited and who didn't benefit from this, and it will shape the politics of the recovery period as well as the crisis period. So